On a quiet street,
I
one
know you
autumn
don't
morning,
know me,
a
but I'm
millionaire in a
here to
wheelchair
help.
stopped when she saw
I
a
can
little
heal
boy
you so
holding
you
a
can walk
cardboard sign
again.
that read, "I heal those who cannot walk." She smiled, thinking it was just a child's game, but what began as a curious encounter would soon become the moment that changed her life forever. Sometimes, the people who seem to have nothing are the ones who remind us what truly matters. Before we begin, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to our stories. May peace, health, and love always find you wherever you are. Tell me from which country and at what time are you listening to this story tonight? In the quiet hills of Asheville, a grand old house stood with its windows closed, like it had forgotten how to breathe. The morning sun tried its best to find its way through the dust on the glass, but the curtains were drawn tight, as if the light itself was no longer welcome. Inside, Margaret Ellison sat in her wheelchair by the window, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hand. For 3 years, she had watched the seasons pass from that same spot. Autumn leaves, winter snow, spring rain, they all came and went. And yet the house remained silent. Thomas Reed, her old housekeeper, moved quietly through the hall, his steps soft enough not to disturb the air. "Would you like me to open the windows, ma'am?" he asked, in his usual gentle tone. Margaret didn't look up. "No, Thomas, leave them closed. The air doesn't change anything." She spoke like someone who had rehearsed the same line too many times. Thomas nodded, though he had heard that answer every day since the accident. He placed a plate of toast beside her, butter melting slowly into the bread, then stepped back with the patience of a man who had long accepted silence as part of his duty. Outside, the wind rattled the branches of the maple trees, carrying the smell of wet earth from the mountains. A faint hum of life stirred from the town below, church bells, laughter. A truck passing over gravel roads, yet none of it entered Margaret's house. Her world was made of echoes and half-memories. That afternoon, her phone buzzed. "Mom?" came a voice bright, young and far away. "Grace," Margaret said softly, straightening slightly. Her daughter's image appeared on the screen. Neat hair, a sharp suit, the polished look of someone used to boardrooms and deadlines. "I'm calling before the meeting," Grace said. "It's getting cold in Asheville. Why don't you come stay with me for Thanksgiving this year?" Margaret gave a faint smile that never reached her eyes. "You know I don't travel much anymore." "Mom, it's been 3 years. You can't just stay locked up there forever." "I'm fine here," Margaret replied, turning her chair away from the window. "I have everything I need, except people," Grace murmured. The line went quiet for a moment. "Grace," Margaret said finally, her voice breaking slightly, "some wounds don't heal by moving places." "Maybe not," Grace said, "but staying still won't help either." When the call ended, the screen reflected her own tired face. She stared at the faint wrinkles near her eyes, the kind that came not from age but from holding back tears for too long. Thomas entered again with a fresh pot of coffee. "She'll come around, ma'am," he said quietly. "Young folks speak fast, but their hearts mean well." Margaret nodded absently. "She has her life, Thomas. I have mine." The clock on the mantel ticked softly, each sound a reminder that time still moved even when she didn't. On the wall hung a framed photograph, a younger Margaret, smiling beside her husband and their newborn daughter. That smile felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone who had lived before the rainstorm, before the crash, before guilt became her only companion. Outside, a flock of birds cut across the gray sky, heading south for the winter. She followed them with her eyes until they vanished beyond the hills. Then she looked down at her legs, pale, still, foreign. "They say the body remembers," she whispered. "But mine seems to have forgotten." That evening, the air outside grew heavy with mist. Thomas lit the lamps along the hallway, each one flickering with a tired golden hue. The smell of cinnamon tea drifted faintly from the kitchen, a small ritual he kept for her, though she rarely drank it. Margaret rolled toward the living room, her fingers gliding across the old piano as she passed. Once, her home had been filled with laughter, music, and guests. Now it was only the ticking of clocks and the sigh of the wind through the chimney. On the mantel sat a box she hadn't opened in years. The wood was darkened by time, its corners worn smooth by hesitant hands. She unlocked it, almost without knowing why. Inside were scattered photographs, some still bright, others fading into sepia. Her hand trembled as she lifted one. A younger version of herself, standing beside a smiling man in a mechanic's uniform. Behind them, a small boy waved at the camera, his smile wide. his hair sticking up like a field of wheat after the rain. The date written on the back blurred beneath her thumb. For a long moment, she simply stared. She remembered the day of the accident, the downpour on the mountain road, the scream of tires, the brief flash of headlights behind her. The man who had died that night had been the one driving her home from a charity event. A kind man, a father. She had never met his family. The guilt still came in waves, years later, like a ghost that refused to fade. Thomas entered quietly, holding a folded blanket. "It's late, ma'am. Would you like me to close the curtains?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She was still holding the photograph. "Thomas," she asked softly, "do you think people can feel forgiveness, even if the ones they hurt are gone?" He paused, his kind eyes resting on her. "I believe some things reach beyond the grave, ma'am. The heart's got its own ways of sending letters." She gave a faint, tired smile. "Then I hope mine finds its way someday." When he left, the house fell silent again. The blanket lay untouched on her lap. The photo box remained open beside her, like a confession laid bare under lamplight. She watched the flames in the fireplace twist and dance, their glow painting warm patterns on the walls. Outside, the trees swayed in the fog, their branches whispering against the window panes. Margaret wheeled herself closer to the window and finally drew the curtains apart. The night spread before her silver, and still, the moon hovering over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Somewhere far below, a train whistle echoed, lonely and distant. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what life might sound like if she had taken another road that night, if the man had lived, if she had never lost the courage to stand. Her eyelids grew heavy. The warmth of the fire softened her thoughts, and the hum of the wind outside lulled her toward sleep. In that half-dreaming space, she thought she heard footsteps on the porch light, almost playful, like a child walking barefoot on wood. She wanted to call out, but her lips didn't move. And then, clear as a bell cutting through the quiet, she heard a boy's voice, soft, certain, and impossibly near. "Don't forget how to walk." Margaret's breath caught. The sound echoed inside her chest, rippling through years of silence. But when she opened her eyes, the room was empty. The fire only embers. And outside, the fog pressed gently against the glass like a hand waiting to be let in. The next morning, someone knocked not on the door, but on the heart she thought had stopped beating. The sound came softly at first, like a bird tapping on the glass, then again, steady and sure. Margaret stirred from her sleep, the remnants of a strange dream still floating in her mind. "Don't forget how to walk." The words from the night before clung to her chest like dew that refused to dry. Thomas was already at the front window, peering through the lace curtains. "There's someone outside, ma'am," he said, his voice uncertain. Margaret turned her wheelchair toward him. "A delivery?" "I don't think so." He hesitated. "It's a boy. Looks about 10, holding a cardboard sign." She frowned. "What kind of sign?" Thomas squinted, reading from a distance. "Says, well, I'll be damned. It says, I can help people walk again." Margaret almost laughed, a small, dry sound she barely recognized as her own. "Send him away, Thomas. It's probably some prank." "Yes, ma'am," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The air outside was crisp with the smell of pine and wood smoke. The boy stood at the edge of the iron gate, his shoes dusted with dirt, his hair a tangle of chestnut curls. His coat was too thin for the weather, and the sign in his hands wobbled slightly in the wind. "You shouldn't be here, son," Thomas said gently. "This is private property." The boy lifted his head. His eyes were clear and steady, the kind that didn't seem to belong to a child. "I don't want anything, sir. I just help people remember how to move." Thomas blinked, at a loss for words. "You help people?" The boy nodded once. "Yes, people who forgot how to walk." From the window, Margaret watched, something tight forming in her chest. There was no mockery in the boy's face, no sign of mischief, only calm, simple belief. When he smiled, it wasn't the kind that demanded attention. It was quiet, honest, almost unsettling in its purity. "Send him away," she said again, though softer this time. Thomas turned to obey, but before he could close the gate, The boy spoke once more, his voice carrying through the still air. "Tell the lady she doesn't need legs to walk. She only needs to remember how." The words hit Margaret like a gust of cold wind. Her hand gripped the armrest of her chair until her knuckles whitened. She didn't know why, but for a fleeting second, her breath caught the way it had the night of the accident. When Thomas returned inside, he looked uneasy. "Strangest thing I ever heard, ma'am." He said what I just told you. Margaret stared past him, through the window where the boy had stood. The gate was empty now, but the image of him lingered. Thin shoulders, small hands gripping a sign too big for him. "Did he ask for money?" she asked quietly. "No, ma'am. Didn't even mention it." "Then what did he want?" Thomas shrugged helplessly. "Said he just wanted to help." Margaret exhaled, her chest heavy. "Help," she repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time. "People don't help without wanting something." Thomas gave her a long, thoughtful look. "Maybe not most people, ma'am. But sometimes the good Lord sends the right kind of stranger." She turned her chair away. "I don't believe in signs, Thomas. Or miracles." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But that boy sure does." The morning light brightened against the curtains, spilling faint gold across the floorboards. Somewhere outside, the sound of a bicycle bell echoed down the road, cheerful, ordinary, alive. But inside the Ellison house, something had shifted, small but real, like the first crack of ice before spring. Later that afternoon, the wind shifted. The gray clouds began to thin, and sunlight spilled over the hills like honey. Margaret sat near the window again, but this time she didn't close the curtains. She could still see faint footprints by the gate, small, uneven marks where the boy had stood. She didn't know what possessed her, but when Thomas came in to ask about lunch, she surprised them both. "Thomas," she said quietly, "if that boy comes back, don't turn him away." Thomas paused, almost dropping the tray in his hands. "Ma'am?" "I said let him stay a while, just to see what he wants." A smile flickered on the old man's face, soft and cautious. "Yes, ma'am." It was near dusk when the gate creaked again. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Thomas went out to meet the visitor, and this time, he didn't try to send him away. The boy approached the porch slowly, wiping his hands on his faded jeans. The cardboard sign was folded under one arm, and in his other hand, he carried a small glass jar filled with clear water. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, standing by the steps. His voice was steady but gentle, like someone older trapped in a small body. "I'm sorry for earlier. I didn't mean to scare anyone." Margaret studied him. Up close, he looked thin but healthy, his skin a little sunburned, his eyes the color of river stones. "What's your name?" she asked. "Illy." "Illy Harper. And you say you help people walk again?" He nodded, his expression serious. "I don't make them walk with their legs. I just help them remember how." She almost laughed again, but something in his voice stopped her. "How does one remember something like that?" she asked. He looked down at the jar in his hands. "Sometimes you have to see yourself the way you were before you forgot." Margaret frowned. "And that's what's in there? Magic water?" He shook his head. "Just water from the creek near my house. But if you believe while you look, it shows you what you miss." For reasons she couldn't explain, she reached out. Thomas stepped forward to help, but she took the jar herself, her fingers brushing the cool glass. Inside, the water trembled slightly in the fading light. When she tilted it, she saw her own reflection, tired eyes, silver hair, a face lined by regret. But beneath that image, for just a second, something flickered, a shadow of herself, younger, standing upright in a field of sunlight. Her breath caught. "What is this trick?" Eli only smiled. "No trick, ma'am. Sometimes you have to look twice to see what's still there." The house seemed to grow quieter around them. Thomas stood by, unsure whether to interrupt. Margaret set the jar on the table beside her. "And what do you want in return for your miracles, Mr. Harper?" she asked. Eli shrugged. "Nothing. I just like helping people." She narrowed her eyes, curious despite herself. "No one helps for nothing." "Then let's just say I'm paying back something that was once given," he replied softly. For the first time in years, Margaret smiled, not out of amusement, but from something deeper, something almost like hope. "Very well," she said. "You can come by again tomorrow. Just don't bring any more water." "Oh." Eli grinned, the corners of his mouth lifting with quiet triumph. "I'll bring stories instead." As he left, the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Margaret watched him walk down the long gravel path until he disappeared around the bend. The jar on the table caught the last of the light, its surface rippling with gold. That night, Margaret placed it on her windowsill. The air outside was still. Not a leaf stirred in the garden, yet the water inside the jar shimmered, as though remembering the touch of the river. Morning crept into the house softly, like a polite guest afraid to disturb its host. Light filtered through the curtains and glimmered on the glass jar by the window. The water inside still shimmered faintly, as if it held a secret of its own. Margaret stirred in her chair, half surprised to find herself looking forward to something, though she would never have admitted it aloud. Thomas was already in the kitchen, humming an old tune from the radio. "Coffee's ready, ma'am," he called. "Smells like we might have a good day for once." Margaret smiled faintly. "Thomas, you think every day is a good day?" He chuckled. "Well, ma'am, one of us has to." After breakfast, Margaret rolled toward the porch. The air smelled of damp leaves and applewood smoke. A truck rumbled somewhere down the road, carrying lumber. And there, by the gate, as if time had never passed, stood Eli. His hands were tucked into his jacket pockets, and his hair caught the sunlight like a halo of brown fire. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellison," he called cheerfully. "Back again, are you?" she said, trying not to sound pleased. "You said I could bring stories," he answered, stepping closer. "So I did." "Oh?" He sat cross-legged at the edge of the porch, while Thomas pretended to sweep leaves nearby, his eyes never leaving the boy. Eli began talking about the creek where he lived, about his grandmother who baked pies for the church every Sunday, about a dog named Scout who followed him everywhere. His words had a way of painting pictures: trees bending over rivers, children running through fields, the smell of rain on tin roofs. Margaret listened, though she didn't mean to. At first, she just nodded, polite and distant. But gradually, something in the boy's voice, the steady rhythm, the unhurried warmth, drew her in. It reminded her of a time long before the accident, when she used to read bedtime stories to Grace, when laughter still lived inside these walls. Thomas brought out lemonade for the boy, served in the chipped blue glass Margaret hadn't used in years. "You've got a talent, son," he said kindly. "You ever thought of being a storyteller?" Eli grinned. "I don't tell stories, sir. I just remind people of their own." Margaret looked at him sharply. "And what do you think mine is?" Eli tilted his head, thinking. "I think you used to build things, maybe houses, maybe dreams. But then something broke, and you stopped believing people needed what you made." For a moment, no one spoke. The wind stirred the curtains, carrying the faint chime of church bells from the valley below. Margaret's voice softened. "You're too young to speak like that." He shrugged. "Maybe. But sometimes young people see what older ones forget." She was about to reply when Grace's car appeared at the end of the driveway. It was a white sedan, sleek and impatient, the kind that didn't belong on country roads. Margaret felt her chest tighten. "Thomas," she said, "please tell her I'm busy." But Grace was already out of the car, heels clicking against gravel. "Busy with what, Mom?" she said, glancing at Eli. "Who's this?" Before Margaret could answer, Eli stood up politely. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Eli. I just come by to help sometimes." Grace's eyebrows lifted. "Help? You mean you're what, doing chores here?" "No, ma'am," Eli said, his voice calm. "I help people remember." Grace gave a polite but puzzled smile. "Right. Well, I think Mom remembers just fine." "Thank you." Her tone wasn't cruel, just protective, the kind that hides fear behind control. Margaret sighed. "Grace, please." But her daughter turned to her, exasperated. "Mom, I came all the way from Charlotte because you won't answer my calls, and now you're talking to a child with a jar of water?" Thomas stepped forward. "Miss Grace, the boy means no harm." Grace looked around, her patience fading. "You all act like this is normal. Mom, you need to see a doctor, not play pretend with strangers." Eli stood silently, eyes downcast. He didn't defend himself. He didn't have to. The weight of the moment spoke louder than words. Margaret's voice trembled. "Grace, stop!" Her daughter froze. It was the first time in years she'd heard that tone, not angry, but pleading. "He's not hurting anyone," Margaret said. "Let him be." For a moment, the two women simply looked at each other, the space between them filled with all the unsaid things years had left behind. Then Grace exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said quietly and walked away. The car door slammed. The sound echoed down the valley long after she was gone. The house fell into a deep stillness after Grace's car disappeared down the hill. The wind returned, whispering through the pines and rattling the shutters like a restless spirit. Thomas gathered the empty glasses from the porch, his movements quiet, deliberate. Margaret watched the dust settle in the light, her heart full of the same heaviness that always came after her daughter left. Eli lingered by the gate. "She's just worried," he said softly. Margaret looked up at him through the window. "Worried or ashamed?" "Both, maybe," he replied. "Sometimes people confuse love with fear. They think if they control it, they can keep it safe." She didn't know how to answer. For all his youth, the boy spoke with a kind of gentle certainty that disarmed her. "You shouldn't know so much about grown-up things," she murmured. He smiled faintly. "You shouldn't have forgotten so much about them." Then, almost without warning, a gust of wind flung open one of the upstairs windows. The curtain billowed like a sail, knocking a picture frame to the floor with a sharp crack. The noise startled them both. Thomas hurried inside, footsteps echoing through the hall. "Must be the storm coming early," he called from upstairs. "Sky's turning fast, ma'am." Margaret wheeled herself to the doorway and looked toward the ridge beyond the fields. The sky had indeed changed, the blue fading to gray, clouds curling like smoke over the mountains. Eli stepped closer to the porch rail. "You should close everything before dark," he said quietly. "The wind will get stronger tonight." Margaret frowned. "How do you know?" He didn't answer right away. "I just remember the sound," he said at last. "When storms come, they make the same sound right before it starts, like someone breathing through a broken door." Thomas came down carrying the fallen frame. The glass had shattered, and a thin crack split the photograph inside. Margaret, her husband, and a little girl, all smiling in front of a lakeside cabin. The break ran straight through the child's face. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "Didn't mean to drop it." "You didn't," she whispered, staring at the photograph. "The wind did." Eli peered at the picture. "She looks like you," he said softly. "When you used to smile." Margaret blinked. "Used to?" "Before the rain came," he said, almost absent-mindedly, as though recalling a dream. A strange chill moved through her. "How would you know about that?" But Eli didn't answer. He only looked toward the hills, his expression far away. "The storm always remembers where it's been," he said. "It comes back for unfinished things." Thomas frowned.
"You talk strange for a boy your age, son."
Eli turned toward him, polite as ever. "Maybe that's because I listen more than I speak." Then he looked back at Margaret. "Don't leave your windows open tonight." With that, he picked up his backpack and started down the path. The sun had already disappeared behind the ridge, leaving the fields bathed in a dim copper light. Margaret called after him, her voice catching. "Eli, wait!" He stopped at the gate and looked back. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked. Eli smiled. "If you listen for the wind, you'll always know when I'm near." "Oh," and with that, he was gone, swallowed by the long shadows of the trees. That night, as Thomas locked the doors and checked the windows, the first drops of rain began to fall. The house creaked softly, like an old body remembering pain. Margaret sat alone by the fire, the broken photograph in her lap. The cracked glass caught the light, splitting her reflection in two, one part past, one part present. Somewhere outside, through the rising wind, she thought she heard a faint voice carried by the storm. "Don't forget how to walk." By midnight, the storm had swallowed the valley whole. Rain lashed against the shutters, each gust of wind shaking the old bones of the house. The oaks outside bent low under the weight of it, their branches scraping the walls like fingers trying to find a way in. Thomas had gone to bed hours earlier, but sleep didn't come easily to Margaret. She sat in her chair by the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket, her eyes fixed on the photograph that lay cracked upon her lap. The glass had splintered through her daughter's face, the younger Grace captured in sunlight, laughing with a joy that now felt almost foreign. She brushed the edge of the frame gently, as though she could smooth the years away. Outside, thunder rolled like a slow heartbeat. Don't forget how to walk, the wind whispered again, faint but unmistakable. Margaret looked toward the window. It was shut tight, yet she could feel the draft seeping through. She told herself she was being foolish. But as lightning split the sky, she saw something move across the yard, a small figure, drenched, standing by the garden fence. Her breath caught. For an instant, she thought it was Eli. She called out softly, "Eli?" No answer, only the sound of rain on the tin roof. When the lightning flashed again, the figure was gone. Margaret's heart thudded painfully. "You're imagining things," she murmured. "Just the storm playing tricks." Still, she couldn't shake the chill that ran through her. The boy's words from earlier, "Don't leave your windows open tonight," echoed in her mind like a warning left unfinished. The fire cracked, sending a spark up the chimney. She leaned forward, staring into the flames. For a moment, the light seemed to form shapes, outlines of a child, a river, a road curving through fog. Memories she'd buried began to stir. It had been 15 years since the accident. 15 years since the rain-soaked road, the tire skid, the sound of Grace screaming her name, and the silence after. Margaret gripped the armrest of her chair. "Enough," she whispered. But the past didn't listen. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. It wasn't loud, more like a single, hesitant tap. She wheeled closer, heart pounding. "Thomas?" she called. No answer. The wind howled again, and the door creaked slightly, as if someone had leaned against it from outside. Margaret hesitated. Then, summoning courage she didn't know she still had, she reached for the handle and opened it a few inches. Rain swept in, cold and sharp. The porch was empty. Except on the mat lay a folded piece of cardboard. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The letters were faded and blurred from the rain, but she could still make out the words, written in that same crooked hand. "I heal those who forgot how to walk." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Eli," she breathed. She looked toward the driveway, but the world beyond was a blur of storm and shadow. No boy, no footprints, just the wind. Clutching the soggy sign, she closed the door and sat back by the fire. She could hear the beams of the house moaning softly under the storm's weight. An old home remembering too much. After a long silence, she whispered to herself, "Maybe the storm didn't come to take something. Maybe it came to return what I lost." Outside, thunder cracked again, shaking the windows. The photograph slipped from her lap and landed face down on the rug. When she bent to pick it up, she froze, for behind the cracked glass, something had changed. The child in the picture, the one whose face had been split by the break, now seemed whole again. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. The rain eased into a steady drizzle, and the first gray light crept through the valley like a sigh of relief. The world outside looked scrubbed, clean, the air sharp with the scent of pine and wet earth. Margaret hadn't slept. She dozed in her chair by the fire, the half-dried photograph resting in her lap. She'd stared at it through the long hours of the night, trying to convince herself she hadn't imagined the change. But as morning came, the truth refused to blur. The crack that once cut through Grace's smiling face was gone. Her hands shook as she touched the glass again. Smooth. Whole. When Thomas entered the room, carrying the morning paper in a steaming mug, she looked up with a strange calm. "Thomas," she whispered, "did you fix this?" He peered down, frowning. "Fix what, ma'am?" "The picture. The glass. It was broken last night." He blinked. "I haven't touched it, Mrs. Ellison. I swear on my late wife's garden." For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, a bird landed on the porch rail, shaking water from its wings. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her voice barely a murmur. "It's impossible." Thomas looked at her kindly. "Maybe not, ma'am. Some things mend themselves when the heart starts to, too." Later that morning, the clouds began to lift. A pale beam of sunlight broke through, scattering across the garden. Margaret watched as it touched the wet flowers, making each droplet glisten like a jewel. That's when she saw him again. Eli was standing by the old oak at the edge of the yard, his jacket still damp from the night before. His cardboard sign was gone. In its place, he held a small wooden bird carved crudely but lovingly, its wings spread wide. Margaret's breath caught. "Eli," she called, her voice trembling. He looked up, smiling as if nothing extraordinary had happened.
"Morning, ma'am. Thought I'd see how you made it through the storm."
She rolled closer to the porch steps. "You were here last night, weren't you?" He didn't answer right away. "Storms find their way to people who need to hear something," he said instead. "Did you hear it?" Her voice faltered. "I heard a voice. And I found your sign." Eli stepped closer, his shoes squishing in the mud. "It wasn't mine anymore," he said gently. "It was yours." She frowned, confused. But something inside her understood in that quiet, unspoken way truth sometimes arrives. Eli handed her the carved bird. "My granddad used to make these," he said. "He said they help people remember what freedom feels like, even if they can't fly." Margaret ran her fingers along the rough wood. "And what am I supposed to remember, Eli?" He met her eyes. "How to stand, not with your legs, but with your heart." She looked away, blinking fast. "You talk like an old man," he grinned. "Maybe I listened to the right ones." Thomas watched from the doorway, hat in hand, his face unreadable. He'd seen many strange things in his lifetime, but this, the look of quiet awakening on Margaret's face, might have been the rarest. The boy turned to leave. "Wait," Margaret called. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Eli smiled. "If the wind brings me, And then he was gone again, walking down the muddy road toward the creek. Margaret sat there long after he'd disappeared, holding the little wooden bird. The sunlight warmed her lap, and for the first time in years, she felt something stirred deep within her legs. Not pain, not movement, just warmth. She didn't believe it. Not yet. But as the wind brushed through the curtains and carried the faint scent of river water into the room, she closed her eyes and whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe it's starting." The next morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of morning that made the whole valley smell like wet grass and second chances. Mist still lingered above the river, curling like breath from something alive. Margaret sat by the open window, the little carved bird resting in her lap. The air was cool, but it didn't bite like before. It felt soft or forgiving somehow. She lifted the bird and turned it over in her hands. The wood was smooth in some places, rough in others, as if carved by a child's unsteady fingers. Thomas appeared at the doorway holding a pot of tea. "You didn't eat breakfast again, ma'am." "I wasn't hungry," she said softly. "But I could use some tea." He poured her a cup and glanced at the wooden bird. "The boy made that, didn't he?" "Yes," she answered. "He said it would remind me how to stand." Thomas smiled faintly. "Maybe he's right. Seems you're sitting a little taller today." She gave a quiet laugh. "Don't tease me, Thomas. I ain't," he said gently. "Sometimes healing starts before we even notice." She sipped her tea, watching the steam twist in the air. Her thoughts drifted toward the boy again, his calm eyes, the way he spoke like he'd lived 100 years. Something about him tugged at a memory she couldn't place, a melody half forgotten. When the clock struck 10, she asked Thomas to take her to the river. He hesitated. "The paths'll be muddy after the rain." "I don't care," she said. "I just need to see it." The road to the river wound through fields still glistening with dew. Thomas pushed her chair slowly, avoiding the puddles. Birds chirped from the hedges. Somewhere, a dog barked and was answered by another. When they reached the water, Margaret asked him to stop. The river glided past, brown and silver under the sunlight. It was quiet except for the whisper of current against stone. "I remember this sound," she murmured. "We used to come here every summer when Grace was small. My husband taught her how to skip stones." Thomas nodded. "He was a good man." She didn't answer. Her fingers tightened on the armrest.
"He was. But I wasn't a good wife. Not after the accident."
The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, but honest. Then, from across the river, came the faint sound of humming. It was low, gentle, almost like a lullaby carried on the breeze. Margaret squinted toward the far bank and saw him. Eli sat on a fallen log, tossing small pebbles into the current. His reflection rippled in the water like a dream refusing to fade.
"Eli!"
she called, voice trembling. He looked up, his grin spreading slowly. "Morning, Mrs. Ellison." She waved. "How did you know we'd come here?" He shrugged, picking up another stone. "This is where everything starts and ends." Thomas crossed his arms. "You've been walking a long way from home, son. Your grandma ain't worried?" Eli smiled faintly. "She knows where I go." Margaret's gaze fell to the water again. You said this river helps people remember. He nodded. It carries stories. You just have to listen long enough. She frowned. And what does it say about me? Eli hesitated, his small hand trailing through the current. It says you once saved someone, but forgot that you did. The words hit her like a cold wind. Save someone? She whispered. Yes, he said, eyes fixed on the flow. A child. Long ago, on this very road. Thomas's brow furrowed. What's he talking about, ma'am? But Margaret's face had gone pale. Fragments of memory flickered in her mind. The rain-slick road, the car swerving, a blur of motion by the guardrail, not just Grace's scream, but another, smaller voice. She swallowed hard. That's not possible. Eli tossed another stone into the water, the splash small but sharp. The river remembers what people try to forget. The air seemed to thicken. Even the birds had gone silent. Then Eli stood, brushing mud from his jeans. You'll remember soon, he said softly. When you do, don't be afraid of what it shows you. He turned toward the trees, leaving behind a single pebble where he'd been sitting. The stone glimmered faintly, shaped almost like a heart. Margaret watched him disappear among the willows, her heart thudding in her chest. Thomas bent to pick up the pebble and handed it to her. Ma'am, he said quietly, maybe he's right. Maybe it's time you remembered. Margaret closed her fingers around the small stone, warm despite the chill. She looked toward the river once more, and for a heartbeat, she saw her younger self in the reflection. Standing on that old mountain road, rain in her hair, reaching toward someone small. Then the image rippled away. The drive back from the river was quiet. The sky had cleared completely now, a soft blue stretching endlessly over the valley. Yet inside Margaret's chest, a different kind of storm began to stir, quieter but heavier. She couldn't shake Eli's words. You once saved someone but forgot that you did. It sounded impossible, and yet the thought would not let go. Back home, Thomas helped her out of the car. You look pale, ma'am. Maybe you ought to rest. I will, she said, though she knew she wouldn't. When he left her alone in the parlor, Margaret sat staring into the afternoon light, filtering through the lace curtains. Dust motes drifted in the air, slow and golden, like memories taking their time to return. On the mantel above the fireplace stood the photograph her husband, little Grace, and beside it the wooden bird Eli had carved. She picked up the bird, tracing the lines of its wings. Then, almost unconsciously, she whispered, "Show me." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air charged. Her mind slipped backward to that night 15 years ago. The rain, the curve of the road, Grace's laughter from the back seat, the flash of headlights. And then a shape on the road, small, soaked, a child. She slammed the brakes. Tires screamed. The world spun white and soundless. When it stopped, she remembered only chaos, the shattered windshield, the smell of gasoline, Grace's terrified cry. But now, in her mind's eye, she saw something she hadn't before. Herself crawling from the wreck, the world tilting, and there in the ditch, a boy no older than 8, coughing, alive. She had pulled him from the rainwater and wrapped him in her coat. Stay awake, she'd whispered over and over before the ambulance light swallowed everything in red. Margaret's eyes flew open. The wooden bird trembled in her hand. Eli's face, his dark hair, the calm in his eyes, it wasn't unfamiliar at all. It was that same child, the one she'd saved. Her voice cracked in the empty room. Oh, dear Lord. Thomas came running at the sound. Ma'am, what's wrong? She looked up, tears spilling freely now. It was him, Thomas, the boy. I saved him that night. He frowned, confused. What boy? The one I hit, the one they said never existed. I thought it was the shock, that I'd imagined it. Thomas hesitated. They said there was no record, ma'am. No second victim. I know, she whispered. But I remember now. He was real. For a moment, the room felt charged with something holy, grief, wonder, revelation. Thomas placed a steady hand on her shoulder. If that's true, maybe he came back to return the favor. She smiled through her tears. He already did. He gave me back the part of me that died on that road. A soft wind slipped through the open window, brushing her face like a hand. She could almost hear Eli's voice in it, light, playful, kind. When the river calls, follow it. It always leads you home. Margaret lifted the wooden bird and set it beside the photograph. The afternoon light glinted off its wings, making them glow faintly as if ready to fly. For the first time in 15 years, she whispered a prayer of gratitude not for a miracle, but for the chance to remember. Outside, the sound of the river carried faintly through the valley, mingling with the distant laughter of a boy. The following days felt lighter, as if the whole valley had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The rain gave way to sun, and even the old house seemed to stand a little straighter. Margaret moved through her mornings with a strange new calm. She asked Thomas to open the windows again, to let the fresh air in. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing, only smiled when he caught her humming an old hymn she hadn't sung in years. But peace, she knew, never came without its shadows. On the third morning after the storm, Grace returned. Her white sedan pulled into the drive just as the church bells from town began to ring 10 o'clock. This time, she didn't look angry, just tired, her face pale beneath her careful makeup. Margaret waited by the window, her wheelchair angled toward the door. When Grace entered, she didn't speak right away. She just stood there, taking in the sight of her mother, awake, alert, eyes clear and bright in a way they hadn't been for years. "Morning, sweetheart," Margaret said softly. Grace hesitated. "You look different." "I feel different," her mother replied. "The storm washed something away, I think." Grace sat down across from her, folding her hands. "Thomas said you've been seeing that boy again. Eli, right?" Margaret nodded. "He's a good child." "Mom, I've been asking around," Grace said, her voice low. "There's no record of any family named Harper around here. No school files, no address, nothing. He just doesn't exist." Margaret smiled faintly. "Maybe not on paper." "That doesn't make sense," Grace snapped, though her tone was more fear than anger. "What if he's dangerous? You barely know him." "Hey." The silence that followed was long, heavy with all the years they'd spent talking around things instead of through them. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Grace, there's something I remembered about the accident." Grace stiffened. "Don't start that again, Mom." "No, listen. There was a boy that night. I pulled him from the road before the ambulance came." Her daughter's eyes filled with pain. "Mom, we've been over this. There was no boy. You were in shock. The police said—" "I know what they said," Margaret interrupted, her voice firm. "But I remember now. His face, his voice, and I've seen him again. He's the same boy." Grace stood, pacing. "You're not making sense. You're letting guilt twist your memory." Margaret looked up at her daughter, her voice steady. "Maybe. Or maybe you're afraid to believe me, because if I'm right, it means miracles are still possible." The words hung between them, fragile and trembling. Outside, a breeze stirred the curtains. The wooden bird on the mantel rocked gently in place. Grace turned away, her shoulders tense. "I just don't want to lose you again," she said quietly. "You sound like you're drifting into something that's not real." Margaret's heart softened. "And I don't want to lose you to fear, darling." Thomas appeared in the doorway then, hat in hand. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you might want to see this." End of flings. He stepped aside, and through the open front door, they all saw Eli standing at the edge of the drive, muddy shoes, solemn eyes. In his hands, he held a small envelope. Grace's face drained of color. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's him." Margaret smiled faintly. He came back. The boy walked up the steps, removing his cap politely. "Morning, Mrs. Ellison, Miss Grace." Margaret nodded. "Eli, you can come in." But he didn't. He looked at her, then at the wooden bird by the window. "I can't stay long," he said. "I just came to return something." He held out the envelope. Inside, Margaret found a faded newspaper clipping yellowed with age, the edges soft. It was dated 15 years ago. The headline read, "Local Woman Saves Child in Mountain Crash." Below it was a grainy photo of a young Margaret Ellison standing in the rain beside an ambulance. In the background, a small boy was wrapped in a paramedic's coat, face turned away. Grace gasped. "That can't be real." Margaret smiled, tears in her eyes. "It is." Eli looked at her one last time. "You didn't just save me," he said softly. "You saved what I was meant to become." Before Grace could speak, he stepped back down the porch steps. The wind picked up again, scattering the leaves across the yard. "Eli, wait." Margaret called. He turned and smiled. You don't need to find me anymore. You already did. End of 14. Then he was gone, walking down the long road toward the river, the sunlight catching in his hair like threads of gold. For a long time after Eli disappeared down the road, no one spoke. The sound of the wind filled the silence, slipping through the open doorway like a ghost from another life. Grace stood frozen, eyes fixed on the newspaper clipping in her mother's trembling hands. I don't understand, she whispered. You said there was no record. That boy just vanished. Margaret smiled faintly, still staring at the photograph. Maybe he never vanished at all. Maybe he's been walking beside us all this time, waiting for me to remember. Grace sank into a chair, her voice soft but brittle. You're telling me he's... What? Some kind of spirit? Margaret didn't answer right away. I'm saying that sometimes what's lost doesn't stay gone. It just changes shape until we can see it again. Thomas stepped forward, clearing his throat. Miss Grace, I saw that boy same as you did. Shook his hand, talked to him. He was as real as this house. Grace looked between them both, torn between logic and longing. Then where did he go? How does he just vanish like that? Thomas's voice dropped to a gentle rumble. Maybe he only comes where he's needed. Margaret reached out and covered her daughter's hand with her own. I used to think faith was for fools, Grace. That believing in what we couldn't prove made us weak. But I've learned something these past weeks. It takes more strength to trust what the heart knows than to cling to what the eyes can see. Grace's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother to hide. I just wanted you to be safe, Mom. I didn't want you chasing ghosts. Margaret's voice softened. He wasn't a ghost. He was a reminder that love doesn't end where logic begins. For a moment, the two women just sat there, the years between them dissolving like frost under morning Sunday. Then Grace reached for the wooden bird on the mantel. He made this, didn't he? Yes, Margaret said. He said it would help me remember what freedom feels like. Grace turned it over in her hands. Maybe it's not just for you. She set the bird between them on the table. And for the first time in years, mother and daughter smiled, the same smile, small, uncertain, but real. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the sound of the river faintly through the trees. Margaret closed her eyes, listening. Do you hear that? She asked softly. Grace nodded. It sounds like water. No, Margaret whispered. It sounds like peace. That afternoon, they drove together to the river. The sunlight shimmered across its surface, bright and gentle. Margaret asked Thomas to stop near the old oak where she had first seen Eli standing. She opened her hand and let the small newspaper clipping drift into the water. It floated for a moment, then sank slowly, carried away by the current. Grace watched silently. Do you think we'll ever see him again? Margaret smiled, eyes glistening. No need to. I think he's where he belongs in every kindness we give, in every hurt we forgive. A heron rose from the shallows, wings wide and white against the blue sky. Margaret followed it with her gaze until it disappeared into the horizon. Do you remember when you were little? She said softly. And you asked me, what happens when we die? Grace nodded. You said love stays behind. Margaret's smile deepened. I think I finally understand what that means. The two women sat quietly by the river until the light began to fade. The sound of the water wrapped around them like a lullaby. Steady, eternal. And somewhere in that music, faint but certain, came the echo of a boy's laughter carried on the wind. The weeks that followed felt like the valley itself was waking from a long sleep. The leaves along the ridge turned gold, the air filled with the smell of wood smoke and apple pie drifting from porches. For the first time in years, laughter returned to the Ellison house, soft, uncertain at first, then growing stronger, like a melody finding its way home. Grace had started visiting every weekend. Sometimes she stayed overnight, helping Thomas reorganize the garden or cook supper in the old cast-iron skillet. They still argued about little things, about everything, but the edges had softened. The words didn't cut anymore. One Saturday morning, Margaret wheeled herself to the porch and found Grace kneeling beside a pile of wooden boards. A new sign leaned against the steps, its letters painted in dark blue. The Luminaria Foundation, a home for children in need. And Margaret stared, speechless. Grace looked up, smiling. You said you wanted to do something that mattered again. I didn't mean this, Margaret whispered, though her heart fluttered. You always said you wanted this house to have laughter again, Grace said softly. So, let's fill it with some. Thomas came around the corner, wiping sawdust from his hands. We've already talked to the folks at the county office. They're willing to help with licensing. Miss Grace has got the paperwork started. Margaret blinked. You did all this without me? Grace grinned. Consider it a surprise, or maybe a thank you. Margaret looked at the sign again. The blue paint gleamed under the morning light, just like the river. Her fingers traced the edges of the carved letters. Luminaria, she repeated. Why that name? Grace shrugged. You used to tell me luminarias were little lanterns people lit on Christmas Eve to help travelers find their way home. Margaret smiled faintly. I remember. Well, Grace said, glancing toward the mountains. I figured maybe it's our turn to light a few. A warmth spread through Margaret's chest, the kind that felt like healing, not hope. Your father would have liked that, she said quietly. They worked through the day, sanding old furniture, repainting walls that hadn't been touched in years. Thomas moved slowly but steady, humming gospel tunes, while Grace measured curtains and Margaret organized books and toys. The house buzzed with purpose. In the late afternoon, when the sun began to dip behind the hills, Margaret asked Thomas to wheel her into the garden. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with orange and rose. The wind rustled through the apple trees, scattering a few leaves at her feet. She could almost hear Eli's voice again, soft as the breeze. You didn't just save me! You saved what I was meant to become. Margaret looked toward the old oak by the gate, the same spot where she had first seen him standing with that crooked sign. For a second, she thought she saw a shadow there, just the outline of a boy watching quietly. But when she blinked, it was gone. Still, she smiled. You kept your promise, she whispered. Thomas appeared beside her. You say something, ma'am? She shook her head, eyes glistening. Just thinking how far we've come. From inside the house came the sound of Grace laughing, a full, unguarded laugh that filled the air like a hymn. Margaret turned her face toward the sound, her voice a murmur. That's what faith sounds like, Thomas. He nodded, hat pressed to his chest. Yes, ma'am. Sounds mighty good. The sun sank lower, painting the porch in gold. The carved wooden bird still sat on the windowsill, its wings catching the light, glowing as though lit from within. And for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel like she was waiting for something to return. She felt finally home. 2 weeks later, the house had changed. Not in its bones, those were still the same creaking floors and wide windows that had watched over decades of summers and storms, but in its spirit. The rooms, once filled with silence and dust, now held the faint hum of life again. The scent of new paint, the laughter of volunteers, the clinking of dishes being washed in the kitchen. The echo of emptiness had been replaced by warmth. That morning, Margaret sat by the parlor window as Grace pinned up soft white curtains. Outside, Thomas was setting up a small swing in the yard. The foundation's first 2 guests, a pair of siblings, maybe 8 and 10, were arriving that afternoon. Margaret couldn't help the tremor in her hands. I'm nervous, she admitted quietly. Grace turned, smiling. You? Nervous? You once ran a company boardroom, Mom. This is different, Margaret said softly. This isn't business. This is heart. Grace knelt beside her chair, taking her hand. That's exactly why it'll work. A car pulled into the driveway just after noon. Thomas greeted the children, a little girl named Lucy, with bright eyes, and her younger brother, Caleb, who clung to a stuffed bear. Their social worker explained the usual things, signed papers, and then drove off. When the car disappeared down the road, an odd stillness fell again, but not the kind that belonged to grief. This was expectancy, like the hush before a candle is lit. Welcome home, Margaret said softly. The girl looked up at her with cautious curiosity. Is this really our home? As long as you need it to be, Margaret replied. Caleb stared at the carved bird on the windowsill. Who made that? He asked. A friend, Margaret said. Someone who helped me remember how to walk. He smiled shyly. It looks like it could fly away. Maybe it already has, she whispered. That evening, after dinner, Grace read a story aloud, while the children sat cross-legged by the fireplace. Thomas dozed in his chair, and Margaret watched the firelight flicker over their faces, small, hopeful, alive. Her gaze drifted to the mantel. The wooden bird seemed to glow faintly in the light, casting a shadow that looked, for just a heartbeat, like the outline of a boy standing by the gate. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Grace opened the front door, expecting the wind, but instead there was a small envelope tucked under the mat. No name, no return address. She handed it to her mother. "Another miracle mail?" Margaret smiled. "Let's see." Inside was a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was familiar, uneven, childlike, full of grace and sincerity. "Dear Mrs. Ellison, the river runs clear again. The lights you lit are reaching the water. Keep them burning. Some of us still need to find our way home. E." Margaret pressed the letter to her heart. She didn't cry, not this time. The tears had already done their work long ago. Now there was only warmth. Grace leaned over her shoulder, whispering, "He found peace, didn't he?" Margaret smiled, eyes shining in the firelight. "Yes, sweetheart, and so did I." The wind picked up outside, rustling the trees. From somewhere down by the river came the faintest sound of boys' laughter, mingled with the rush of water and the whisper of leaves. And in that sound was everything: forgiveness, love, and the quiet strength of a life rebuilt from grace. Margaret looked at the children by the fire, then at her daughter. "Let's keep the windows open tonight," she said softly. Grace looked up. "Why?" "So the light can reach whoever's still out there." The fire crackled, the night deepened, and as the stars rose over the valley, the house glowed softly, not just with warmth, but with purpose. Winter came softly that year. Frost painted the valley white, and the river, half frozen, murmured beneath its thin shell of ice. From the porch, Margaret watched the world glitter in silence, her breath clouding in the cold air. The Luminaria Foundation was alive now, laughter in the halls, little hands tugging at sweaters, the smell of hot cocoa in the kitchen. Every sound filled the spaces where loneliness used to live. Grace had moved back for good. "Temporary," she said at first. But the way she smiled over morning coffee told another story. Thomas stayed too, slower these days, but proud like an old tree still offering shade. That afternoon, the mail arrived with a small box, no return address. Inside was a smooth river stone carved with a single word: "Remember." Margaret turned it over in her palm, feeling its weight, its warmth, though it was cold as snow. She knew who had sent it. She went down to the river before dusk. The air smelled of pine and smoke. The water glided past quietly, carrying the faint reflection of the house's golden lights. Margaret knelt by the bank, the stone in her hand. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "Now it's my turn." She placed the stone into the river. It sank slowly, disappearing into the dark water with barely a ripple. For a moment, she thought she saw a shimmer like sunlight beneath the current, and a boy's shadow walking beside it. Grace's voice called from behind, soft and sure. "Mom, dinner's ready." Margaret smiled, eyes still on the river. "Coming, sweetheart." She turned toward the house, glowing against the twilight. Children's laughter spilling out through open windows, light reaching the valley, just as he'd said it would. And for the first time, she didn't look back. That night, the house glowed like a lantern against the dark hills. The laughter of children drifted through open windows, mingling with the whisper of the wind. Margaret sat by the fire, the wooden bird on her lap. Its wings had dulled with age, but in the flicker of the flames, it still seemed alive. Grace brought her a blanket and sat beside her, silent for a while. "Do you ever think about him?" Grace asked softly. "Every day," Margaret replied. "But not with sadness. He's part of the river now, and the river never forgets." Outside, snow began to fall, slow, delicate, endless. The world looked washed clean again. Margaret smiled faintly. "When I'm gone, keep the windows open, Grace." Her daughter turned to her, puzzled. "So the light can still reach whoever's lost," Margaret said. Grace took her hand. "It will, Mom. I promise." They sat together in the quiet, the fire burning low, the wind humming gently in the eaves. Somewhere in that hush, faint and fleeting, came a sound, a boy's laughter, soft as running water. Margaret closed her eyes, her heart full. The house breathed with life, with love, with remembrance. Outside, the river shimmered under the falling snow, carrying forward everything that once was, and everything yet to be. And above it all, the lights of Luminaria burned steady through the night, guiding hearts home. Sometimes, the stories that stay with us the longest are not the loud ones filled with noise and glory, but the quiet ones whispered in the stillness of an ordinary evening. Margaret's story began in guilt and ended in grace. She thought her life had passed her by, yet one small boy with his muddy shoes and gentle eyes showed her that redemption is not a destination, but a choice made in the smallest acts of love. Through that child, she remembered how to care again, how to forgive herself, and how to open her home and heart to others who needed the same light. The Luminaria Foundation became her final chapter, a home built not of wealth, but of warmth. Children found laughter there, families found hope again, and the house by the river became more than wood and stone. It became a heartbeat, steady and kind. The river that once carried her sorrow now carried the echoes of joy, washing through every corner of her new life. Love, in its truest form, is the quiet decision to care without expecting anything in return. Redemption is not about erasing the past, but transforming it into something that can heal others. Real wealth is measured in kindness, the meals shared, the forgiveness given, the light we leave burning for those still finding their way home. Like a soft porch light glowing through the night, even the smallest act of goodness can guide someone out of their darkness. Maybe that's offering a ride to an old neighbor, baking cookies for the church sale, or simply calling someone who's been alone too long. These are the moments that hold the world together, thread by gentle thread. Because in the end, what truly matters is not how long we live, but how deeply we touch the lives around us. The river remembers every kindness, every tear, every act of courage. It reminds us that love doesn't fade, it flows forward, finding new hearts to carry it on. So tonight, as you listen and reflect, think about the people who once lit a candle for you, and those who might be waiting for your light now. If this story touched your heart, type 1 in the comments to let us know. And if you think we can make these stories even more meaningful, type 0 and share your thoughts. Because stories, like rivers, only live when they keep flowing, and your voice helps them find their way home.